This is the KC Show. I'm Kyle Cushman, and welcome into the season preview for the Ottawa Charge, who begin their season today, if you're watching this the day that this was posted, against the New York Sirens. This is an Ottawa team that went all the way to the Walter Cup final after barely making it into the playoffs, having to win in overtime in the last day of the regular season, make the playoffs, beat the Montreal Victoire, the top-seeded Victoire, who chose to play Ottawa in the first round, go on to the Walter Cup final, ultimately come up a couple wins short, but a great run with a bunch of overtime games, a bunch of tight games in that run, and then went into the offseason and things kind of got picked apart. You look at the offseason where you knew you were going to be losing pieces in the expansion draft, and they certainly did. But then they also lost pieces in free agency where they weren't able to retain their top talent that were free agents. And so it leaves Ottawa in this precarious position where they took some swings in the draft. They need those to hit this season, and they need their top players to be some of the top players in the entire league if they're to make the playoffs again and go on another run that they did last season. So let's begin by looking at the offseason and beginning by the players that have departed, and then we'll finish on the happy note by the players that are in the door for Ottawa. Teresa Vanashova out the door in free agency, as did Cheyenne Darkangelo. Two significant losses, two great pieces in the top six that are going to be very hard to replace. But you also lose second overall pick Danielle Sardachny in the expansion process, who was an awkward fit in terms of the way that they used her for much of last season. Struggled out of the gate a little, or was pretty good out of the gate and then had some struggles and then ended up a fourth liner that never really was able to make her way out of that role. I think from already what we've seen in Seattle, it's going to be a great fresh start for her, but she leaves in the expansion process. Victoria Bach ends up retiring, and then Natalie Snodgrass leaves in free agency as well. On defense, things were picked apart. Aneta Taylor-Rolova and Ashton Bell, the first two picks in the expansion draft, but also Jinsey Rose leaving in free agency, as did Zoe Boyd, and then Emerence Mashmeyer leaving in the expansion process. Some significant names there, some significant pieces, all leaving this offseason, and the Charge weren't really able to replace them with established players. You look at the free agency moves that the Charge were able to make, only one established player comes in the door, and that's Brooke Hobson, because they opted to cut Elizabeth Giguere after training camp. So only one established veteran coming in the door this offseason. The rest all either draft picks or undrafted free agents. At forward, Anna Shokina, the big swing in the second round, Russian forward, who we haven't seen play against top competition in multiple years, but one of the best players in Russia, comes over here with a ton of skill. We'll see if she's able to make it work in the PWHL. Then also Sarah Wozniewicz, just a pretty gritty bottom six player who has a history with Carla McLeod out of Wisconsin. Peyton Hemp, forward out of Minnesota. And then Fenuza Kadyrova, who played with Shokina in Russia as a late round pick there as well. We'll see, again, what both those Russian players can do, and we're going to be talking about that a bunch more here in a moment here. Mentioned Brooke Hobson as well, the lone free agent signing. Rory Gilday, the first round pick coming in the door on the defense, and then Kate Riley, an undrafted free agent out of Quinnipiac, took a year off, is back here in the women's game and is an intriguing undrafted free agent bet who could be an undrafted free agent that makes a bit more noise than your typical UDFA. And then between the pipes, Sani Ahala, the draft pick, and Kendra Woodland replacing Logan Angers as the third string goaltender. So let's begin by looking at my 5 big questions. And the first one is relating to those free agency losses. How did the Charge make up for the 23 top 6 goals that were lost in the offseason? Vanashova, top scorer last season, 15 goals, second only to Marie-Philippe Poulin, out the door Vancouver as a free agent. Cheyenne Darkangelo, 8 goals, top 6 center for Ottawa last season. One of the bright spots for Ottawa last season in terms of a player that really struggled in year number 1 in the PWHL and really found her game and her groove last season. She's out the door as well to the Montreal Victoire. So as much as people point to the expansion process, in my opinion, it's almost more of the free agency process that hurt the Ottawa Charge. Yes, losing Taylor-Rolova and Bell and Sardachny and Mashmeyer in expansion, that's all significant losses, of course. But the real significant blow was losing Vanashova and Darkangelo and Rose and Boyd all in free agency as well, and not being able to bring in any significant pieces there as well. So it relies on the draft to try and supplement that? Can you get more goals from Emily Clark? Can you get a bounce back season in terms of some bigger goal production from Brianne Jenner? Can you get a little bit more from Gabby Hughes? Can those rookies make an impact enough to help replace those 23 top six goals? Because it isn't just those goals that you're replacing as well. It's the goals that you're losing in Serdachny and Bach and Rose and Taylorlova and Bell as well. So it's not just the 23 goals that you have to replace. That's just in the top six. So you look at the projected lineup and it's like, is Shokina and Kadyrova able to replace all of that in their first season against top competition in multiple years? That's a tall task. Can Katerina Mrazova stay healthy and help replace that? That's definitely something you can look at. But you're going to need a big jump from a handful of players or players to beat their expectations coming into the season if you're to replace that kind of goal total. And so I guess the opposite way to look at it is, okay, if you can only replace X amount of goals there, can you then prevent X amount of goals as well? And I think that's probably the more likely path that the Charge have to go down, because I look at this defense and there's some intriguing defensive shutdown potential here to be one of the better defensive units in the league. You look at Jocelyn the Rock as the North Star there as the veteran leader on this group, but Rory Gilday, I have a ton of faith in to be a shutdown defender at this level. You look at Rania Savalainen and the faith in her to protect her in the expansion draft process. Well, you're going to have to put a lot of faith in her this upcoming season to prove that that was the right decision to make. Some things like that. And then you have some players that probably have to prove a little bit more on defense there as well. But is there a path to replacing enough goals in the top six and maybe stopping a couple more over the course of the season? I think that's probably the combination that the Chargers are going to have to look at, rather than just straight up replacing 23 goals in the top six. That's going to be a tall task to do straight up for the likes of Shokina and Kadyrova and Mrazova, even though that you might get a little bit more from Clark and Hughes and Jenner as well. It's going to be a tall task to replace that many goals that high in the lineup with only rookies really coming in the door at forward. So moving to the next part, which kind of ties into that first part about the lineup and what the Chargers are looking to do here. Can the Russians actually be needle movers? Not just players that are effective. Like you look at what like Anna Meixna was last season, coming over from Sweden, an MVP type player at times in Sweden, comes over and is a good bottom six player, but certainly not a needle mover in the top six offensively or anything like that. And I think Meixna could have an even better season this year, just kind of having some comfort coming into her second season in the league here. But in terms of the Russians being legit needle movers, you need them to be players that produce offensively and like legit produce, not just like 6 to 8 points or some stuff like that, and maybe give you some depth scoring. The way that this roster breaks down and kind of the projected lineup and where they need these players to be, if the Chargers are to be competitive this season, they need those players to be 12 to 18 point type players consistently on the score sheet over the course of the season and playing important roles in the top six, specifically Anna Shokina, because at the draft, using a second round pick on her is significant. And the way that they talked about her at the draft, talking about how they believe that she has superstar potential in this league, there's going to be a trial period or a transitional period, of course, where those players are getting adjusted to this game, and it's going to take a couple of weeks. It's going to take a month. It's going to take 6 weeks for them to truly get comfortable here, if they even get comfortable at all in the first season, just given all the barriers that they have to overcome coming to North America and playing at this level. But when you talk about somebody as being superstar potential and they're not 22, they're 27, you're going to have to see that sooner rather than later, especially given the place that this roster is in. And then Kadyrova to a lesser extent, just because she was I believe a 6th round pick. I believe the last pick that the Charge made in the draft. You can get away with her being maybe a bit of a lesser impact player, but if you're going to be a competitive team, you probably need her to be a pretty good player in the league straight from the get-go, and probably playing on a line with Shokina, maybe just given some of the language barrier and some things like that. But there's a couple other ways that you could deploy the lineup as well that can maybe maximize things in a different way. So overall, the point being, with the top 6 departures in Vinisheva and Darkangelo, and no significant players coming in the door in terms of free agency, because Elizabeth Jaguar was cut in the training camp process leading into the season. The onus is going to be on Shokina and Kadyrova to step up as some older rookies that are coming over from a league where they scored a bunch, and it's not going to be nearly as easy to score here, but you're going to need them to be some difference makers and some needle movers, because you look at Wozniewicz, and I don't really see her being a big scorer in this league. I can see her being a good player in this league, probably not a scorer that's playing in your top six. Same for Peyton Hemp as well. And so overall, you're leaning on those additions of the Russians, who are huge wildcards coming into the season, to be those needle movers to help replace the goals that you're losing up front. And again, to the point of players helping replace the goal totals, brings me to my third big question, and it's revolving around Emily Clark. Signs the extension this offseason that reportedly, according to the AP, makes her the highest paid player this season in the PWHL. So can Clark find another level offensively this season? We know her great two-way game. We saw her elevate in terms of her play at the end of the regular season and then definitely throughout the playoffs. But if you're going to be the highest paid player this season and you're going to have two significant departures in the top six, and you're going to be that top line forward, and with Jenner kind of taking a bit of a step back last season, and Clark, the way she finished the season and played throughout the playoffs, I think most people would agree she's the top player on this roster, at least at forward now. And so the pressure is on Emily Clark to be even more of an impactful player offensively this season. We know she's going to be good. I think there's a very high floor for Emily Clark's game in terms of what she can do in this league and what she's done in this league. But I think the pressure is going to be on her to be even more of an offensive player this season, to produce a little bit more, to have a point total in the low to mid 20s, to be their leading scorer this season. All of those factors that she hasn't necessarily had to do in the past. In year number one, it was more Brianne Jenner doing that, and Daryl Watts being that creative offensive player. In year number two, it was Teresa Vanashova really stepping up as the goal scorer, and Emily Clark was there as kind of that next scorer, but didn't have to be that number one scorer throughout the season. I think this year, you look at the roster, and unless Brianne Jenner has a big bounce back to being one of the top players in the league, or unless Anna Shokina comes out of the gates flying and is this underrated superstar gem that we're not expecting, it's going to have to be Emily Clark as the top forward on this roster, the top scoring forward. And I think there's a path to her being able to do that on a team that makes the playoffs, but she's going to have to level up here this season. I think she has it in her to do it. But yeah, that's one of the big things I'm watching for with the question marks at forward in terms of how you replace those goals. I think a lot of it could lie on Emily Clark's shoulders to be a player that steps up offensively in that role. And again, staying at forward, because I like what they got between the pipes, obviously, in Gwyneth Phillips. I like a lot of what they have in the top four on defense, and the size and the physicality and skating of LaRock and Gilday and Savalainen. But the forward depth leaves me wanting a lot more. So that's where a lot of my questions are here. And to question number 4, is Brianne Jenner beginning to regress? You look at her finish to year number 1. She was one of the most dominant offensive players in the back half of the season, on a line with Katerina Mrazova and Daryl Watts. Watts departs in the offseason last year. Mrazova's hurt for most of last season, and Jenner's production takes a step back. Is there a way to manufacture that line again, where you have Jenner and Mrazova and Anna Shokina steps into that role? Can you manufacture that kind of role again and maybe get some more out of Brianne Jenner again? It's quite possible. I think it's, given the lack of center depth and maybe some other things regarding some of the language barrier as well for the Russian players and some things like that, I think it's more likely that she begins the season playing with Hughes and Clark on that top line. And so, again, she's going to be playing big minutes this season. She's going to be leaned on as the captain. I think the question is, in this Olympic year as well, with her kind of pushing more towards the bubble of that Canadian Olympic roster, is where is Brianne Jenner's game still at? Is it at like the 90% of what her peak was? Or are we starting to dip down the slope a little bit more as she enters her mid-30s and kind of that natural aging curve? Again, I kind of mentioned it with Natalie Spooner in the Toronto Scepters preview I did, but you talk about the aging curves and some things like that, but then you also look at what Hilary Knight's done, and you look at what Marie-Philippe Poulen's done in their mid-30s in this league, and it feels like they're only getting better year in, year out. So certainly it could be a slight blip on the radar for Brianne Jenner, and she bounces back in a big way and has a huge season and is on the Olympic team and a significant factor, and all those factors that could happen here. But the question for me is she beginning to regress here? And last season was the start of her starting to wind down in her career in terms of how impactful she is at the top of the lineup and being that top player, franchise player for a team that can lead a team to a playoff spot, that kind of player? Or is she now a complimentary top 6 player? Or kind of where is she on that progression? I think she's more likely to bounce back than she is to kind of continue to fall down the scoring ladder. I still have a lot of faith in Brianne Jenner as a player, but I'm curious to see how she's utilized this season in terms of her line mates and kind of where she ends up over the course of the season in terms of what her role is like and where her point totals end up over the course of the season and where she's at in terms of that aging curve. Is she more the Poulin Knight continuing to rise up and bouncing back, kind of similar to what Hilary Knight did last season after a bit of a down year one, or is she beginning to kind of regress into the later part of her career? That's something I'm going to be keyed in on at the beginning part of this season in particular. And again, kind of continuing with that kind of veteran player that is in the later stages of their career. Question number 5 for me regards the defense, and will Jocelyn Larocque be leaned on too much on this Ottawa Charge defense? You look at the group that they have here, and you have Jocelyn Larocque, of course, who was on the top pairing in the playoffs alongside Ashton Bell. But then you have Rory Gilday, who's a rookie. Then you have Rania Savalainen, who was protected in the expansion process, but played the 5th most minutes out of any Ottawa defender in terms of average time on ice in the regular season, and was kind of this 3rd, 4th option in the playoffs with Jincy Rose out due to injury. So as much as I believe in Savalainen and Gilday to be those kind of top of the lineup type defenders, Larocque is the one that has actually done that to this point in the league. And I worry if you lean on her too much, especially early on in the season, as great as Jocelyn Larocque is and as great of a gas tank she has, I worry about her being the number 1 defender at this stage of her career, where in Toronto she got to lean on Renata Fast at that point of her career. Last season with the Charge, she got to lean or at least have Ashton Bell on her pairing and had Aneta Taylor-Lova there as well. And in the regular season had Jincy Rose there as well. And even Zoe Boyd there to help supplement in the top 4 or just kind of in general. As kind of the clear-cut number 1 defender to at least start the season, we'll see how the roles progress over the course of the season. I think you have to be careful with leaning on her too much early in the season and maybe wearing her out over the course of the year. I think that the coaching staff has to put a lot of faith in Gilday as a rookie and has to put way more faith in Savalainen this year after being a first-year North American pro last year. She knows what the game is like. She's adjusted. She's familiar. She's had an offseason of training, knowing what that's like. You have to put a lot more faith in her to be a kind of top pairing number 1 type defender. So for me, the question regarding the defense is Larocque's usage over the course of the season, and if she's going to be leaned on too much with all the departures on defense here. So let's continue on to my gals. If you are just tuning into this one for the first time in terms of my season previews, my gals is just a segment where I highlight 3 players that I either view as depth players that I particularly like watching, players that I have keyed in on as players who I think can elevate and play higher roles than they have yet to do in the PWHL, those kind of things. Not necessarily talking about the star players that everyone knows, talking about some secondary or tertiary players that I particularly like to watch or believe in becoming more significant players over the course of their PWHL careers. So beginning with a player that we just kind of talked about, my gal number 1 here is Rania Savalainen. You look at her game and her makeup and everything that she has in her toolkit and kind of in her profile screams top defender here in the PWHL. Physical, great skater, 5'10", has the size there, has some offensive skill as well. She was one of those players that made the transition from the SDHL to the PWHL with no prior North American experience last season. That's a big jump. And we saw some other players, particularly forwards, kind of struggle in that way. Savalainen was playing kind of third pairing or fringe second pairing minutes over the course of most of last season. And then she was protected in the expansion process, which really shows you the belief that the staff has in terms of her potential here. And well, after winning her minutes at 5-on-5, 18-9 last season, and playing in that fifth kind of role over the course of the regular season, where you look at Larocque, Rose, Taylorlova, and Bell playing bigger roles than her over the course of the season, I look at her size, I look at her being able to make the adjustment last season and knowing what it's going to be like this season, and I look at the defenders that are all out the door, and you look at the opportunity in the top four, she's got to be, if not your number one defender, your number two defender this season in terms of usage, in terms of power play time, all of that stuff. I think she can be one of the better defenders in this league, just given what she showed in year number one, making that big adjustment from the Swedish league to the PWHL. I have a ton of faith in her becoming that top pairing legit defender that plays 22, 23, 24 minutes a night. It's up to the Charge now to let her loose this season and actually give her those minutes and see if she can sink or swim in those minutes, because we saw last season she excelled in those lesser minutes against maybe lesser competition. You don't have that luxury of having Bell and Taylorlova and Rose and those players this season. She's got to play a bigger role. I'm looking for her to play a significant role this season, and I believe that she can excel in that role, given her physical makeup, given her skill set, and given the results that she showed last season in her first year in the PWHL. Continuing on, and kind of similarly, a player that I think has a lot of similar characteristics to Savalainen is Rory Gilday. And I'm talking about a first-round pick here, but I don't think Gilday gets the kind of shine as this kind of exciting first-round pick because she's this defensive defender. She's not this exciting offensive piece like a Casey O'Brien or a Kristina Koltunkova or even an offensive defender in the numbers that Haley Wynn put up. But I think Rory Gilday can have arguably the biggest impact out of any of those players immediately out of the gate because of the kind of player that she is. I think the rest of those players might have some growing pains, at least in their first couple of games, and kind of figure things out. But I think Gilday is the type of player that will be a legit top four defender from day one. And I think is somebody that can play 21, 22, 23 minutes very early in her PWHL career. It's the size, it's the physicality, and it's the skating. She's like 5'11". She's a very good skater, very mobile, especially given her size. And the PWHL allows her to express her physicality even more than we saw in college. She's been on Team USA's before. I think she should be on Team USA at the Olympics going forward just because of her versatility, her ability to play the right and the left. She played a bunch on her offside in college. And you look at this group on defense for the Ottawa Charge, and there's one right shot defender on the roster. So you need somebody to move on to the right side in your top four. I think Gilday is the type of player to do that. I love her fit with Rania Savalainen. I love her fit with Jocelyn Larocque. I would actually have her start with Larocque to kind of be this player coach almost and really help her along early on in her career here in the PWHL. You hear how anybody who's played against or with Gilday and the way that they talk about her, and it's with such high praise. And you think about the way that, like, it's speaking with Jocelyn Larocque at the Olympic training block and talking to her a little bit about Gilday and what she brings to the roster, and seeing the praise that somebody like Larocque has for Gilday and the veteran leadership that she can have for somebody like Gilday. I think there's a lot of potential for Gilday to be one of the elite shutdown defenders in the league. And I think there's a little bit of offensive potential there as well, just given her skating ability. I think she can move the puck pretty well as well. So I think she's going to have the opportunity to get some offensive reps here. She's not just going to be used in a defensive situation because, again, you look at the roster and it's like, who's going to be your power play people? Who's going to be your offensive zone people on the blue line? Savalainen, I think, is the first one that comes to mind with her big shot and kind of some of the numbers she produced last year. You think Jocelyn Larocque is probably in that mix just given her veteran kind of cachet in the league. But then it's like, is Kate Riley going to do that as a UDFA coming after a year away from the game? Is Stephanie Markowski going to be able to do that? Is Brooke Hobson going to be able to do that? So I think the opportunity is going to be there for Gilday to get offensive touches. And I think that's going to help her find her offensive game. And I think it's going to help her kind of flourish in this league in terms of really maximizing her potential, especially early on in her career. So continuing on to the last one here, and it's very on brand for me. I'm talking about a U Sports player and a goaltender. Kendra Woodland, I was very happy to see her get the invite to Ottawa Charge camp. I was just kind of expecting her to be the fourth goaltender in camp and end up being released just because Logan Angers, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name properly. But she was there last season and had a relationship with the goaltenders and all that stuff. But I believe in Woodland to be a bit of a hidden gem here, a goaltender that could legit prove themselves as a capable PWHL goaltender. And if she gets some minutes, I'm intrigued to see what she can do. She was an absolute stud at the University of New Brunswick. In 27 career playoff games, she had a .958 save percentage. She was the U Sports Player of the Year in 22-23, where she had a .960 save percentage in the regular season as well. U Sports is often overlooked. U Sports has some hidden gems there. And I think Kendra Woodland, given her resume and what she did in U Sports, is deserving of an opportunity here. And she's a player that has been to Team Canada summer camps before and has been in that mix as a developmental player with Team Canada. So I'm very excited to see her get this opportunity here. She wasn't playing hockey at all last season, was away from the game after her collegiate career ended at UNB. She's back in the mix here, got the opportunity with the Ottawa Charge in camp, and I think she's a player that has potential. She's probably just going to be the third string goalie because Sani Ahola is there. She has the international resume, some things like that. I'm a little bit lower on Ahola. I kind of look at her being outplayed a little bit by her peers in St. Cloud and some of the struggles she's had at the World Championships against some of the top teams recently. I think that she's obviously going to be the one that gets the backup role to begin. But if she struggles in that role or falters at all, I think Woodland is a player that is intriguing that if she gets an opportunity, could make the most out of it. Whether that's longer term and she kind of bides her time as a third string goaltender in this league, or if she gets an opportunity sooner rather than later. But overall, I'm very glad to see somebody like Kendra Woodland in this league, and I hope she's in this league for a handful of years and gets an opportunity to play at some point, because she's somebody that I believe in that resume she has in U Sports, and I think she's somebody that should get an opportunity to prove herself in the professional game at some point here in the coming years. So those are my gals on the Ottawa Charge. Let's get to my projected lineup. And this one's a bit tricky because I can't quite do the lineup the way I want to. I think the way that I would ideally do it is have Shokina with Mrazova and Jenner and try and recreate the magic that you had in season number 1 with Daryl Watts with Mrazova and Jenner, with the silky mitts that Shokina has and trying to maximize her offensive potential. But if you do that, then there's a hole at first line right wing alongside Clark and Hughes. And last year it was filled by Mann and McMahon, but this season you're lacking an extra center, which was previously Cheyenne Darkangelo. And I don't really see anyone on this roster that can really fill that third line center role the kind of way that I think you need to, unless maybe Peyton Hemp can slide in the middle and can maybe outperform her draft slot. So for me, I would ultimately go with Clark, Hughes, Jenner, and then Shokina, Mrazova, Katarova. You have the two Russian wingers playing together, so you have at least the language barrier lesser, and Katarina Mrazova as a player, just being an international player who has played with so many different players who speak different languages, either in Sweden or previously in the NWHL, PHF, and the PWHL. She's played with a bunch of different players who speak a bunch of different languages, so I think she would be okay to play with two players that maybe speak a different language and would be able to mix well in terms of their skill sets there, in terms of them being very skilled players. And then that has Mann and McMahon move back to the center, which she played at Minnesota Duluth in college, and then have her with Anna Meixna and Rebecca Leslie. That's a line that I think can eat some defensive zone starts and be a bit more defensive versus a very offensive second line. And then just a very grindy, gritty energy line as a fourth line with Sarah Wozniewicz, Alexa Vasco, and Peyton Hemp, Taylor House as your extra forward there. The one intriguing thing here is Olivia Wallin coming in after being cut by the Seattle Torrent. She was a point per game in college last season at Duluth. I think she's somebody that we could see activated to the main roster at some point this season, coming over from Seattle after being cut from them in camp if they need a bit more offense in the bottom six, because just given, again, kind of the collegiate resumes, Wallin is somebody that at least produced a little bit more than the likes of Wozniewicz and Hemp in their last year in college. But I think that's what's likely going to be the roster up front this season to begin the season. And it's what I would do as well, just kind of with a lack of an extra third line center option beyond Man and McMahon, kind of leaves you kind of forced to go with this kind of group, I think, in the top 9. But if there's a way that you can find an extra center here in this lineup and you can have McMahon on the top line again with Clark and Hughes, because that line was so good in the playoffs, and then you can have Shokina with Mrazova and Jenner, I think that's my ideal top 6. But again, it comes back to the third line kind of being left in a much lesser position if that's the case. So continuing on to defense, I talked about it a little bit already. From as soon as the draft pick was made, I've wanted to see a Larocque-Gilday pairing. I think that's going to get the most out of Gilday early in her PWHL career, to play with a player like Jocelyn Larocque and get to learn from a player like Jocelyn Larocque. I think longer term, you might look to a Savaline and Gilday pairing as your top pairing, and maybe move Larocque down the lineup over the course of the season. But to begin the season, I love the idea of Larocque-Gilday. To the second pairing, Savalainen and Markowski. I think they're interchangeable on the left and right. They played a little bit together last season. I want to see Savalainen get some big minutes, though, this season and play in all situations. I'm very high on her skill set and what she can do in this league if given the opportunity. And then the third pairing of Brooke Hobson and Kate Riley. Hobson didn't have great results in New York and kind of was pushed down the lineup over the course of her tenure in New York. Can she bounce back on a third pairing here in Ottawa? And then Kate Riley had great numbers in her last season at Quinnipiac. Didn't play last season. She's coming back now, undrafted free agent. I think she's somebody that, if she finds her groove here, is somebody that could play her way into a top 4 role and maybe usurp Markowski in the top 4 here. So I think that's overall the defensive lineup to at least start for the Ottawa Charge. So where will the Charge finish this season? It's a tough one here, because year number 1, they're right in the mix. At the end of the season, they lose that final game of the regular season. They miss the playoffs. Last season, if they don't win that overtime game, they miss the playoffs again and finish 5th out of 6. I think they're going to be a hard out. I think they're going to be a scrappy, competitive team, but I don't really see the kind of depth that some other teams have, and I don't see the high end that some other teams have. So if this team is going to really contend, it comes to the goaltending, and it's Gwyneth Phillips, who has to be the MVP of this team. And I think if the Charge are to make the playoffs here, not only is Gwyneth Phillips going to be a goaltender of the year candidate, I think she might have to be an MVP candidate, because I don't really see the way that the Charge are going to be a top-end offensive team. So then you're going to have elite defensive results, and I think that's going to really come from a well-rounded top 4 where Larocque, Gilday, and Savalainen play big minutes and excel in those minutes. But then Phillips is also one of, if not the best goaltender in the league this season. Obviously, she's not going to be the goaltender she was in the playoffs over the course of an entire regular season. But clearly her game really rounded a corner coming back from the World Championships, where she got to be that day in, day out starter and kind of knew the role she was getting into, versus early on last season where she was a backup for the first time in many years and was maybe a little more uncomfortable in that role, playing to the peak of her abilities. So yeah, I think she's going to have to be like a 925 save percentage, and you're going to have to get some good results from your defenders and your forwards and a couple surprises there if you're going to be a team that challenges for a playoff spot. My range for the Ottawa Charge this season is 4th to 8th. I think if they make the playoffs, it's going to be in a scrappy way as the number 4 seed, with Gwyneth Phillips playing insane this season and kind of getting some good results out of Emily Clark's and Brianne Jenner's and Rory Gilday's and Rania Savalainen's and Shokina Katarova, those types of players all excelling and maybe exceeding expectations this season if they're going to sneak into the playoffs. I don't really see a path to them being one of the top teams in the regular season, just given how formidable and deep the Victoire and the Golden Eyes and the Torrent and to a lesser extent, the Scepters as well all look. And then you also think about just kind of what the Frosts have been and the upstart Sirens. And then all of a sudden you're talking about them and the Boston Fleet as 7th and 8th in the standings. For me, I do have the Charge 7th in my standings here in the 8-team league. I think they project to be better than the Boston Fleet. I see an easier path to them being a better team than the Boston Fleet. But I see a better path forward to the playoffs for kind of every other team in the league other than Boston. That's not to say they can't or they won't, but I look at the last 2 seasons where they barely made it into the playoffs last season and they missed the playoffs in year number 1, and you have so many losses in the free agency and expansion process over the course of this summer, where I think you're asking too much out of too many people to exceed expectations to be able to hit that benchmark again. So ultimately, I have the Ottawa Charge missing the playoffs here, but I think there's a lot of players to like on this roster. I think this is going to be a very likable roster as well for Ottawa Charge fans, and a very unlikable team for other teams playing against them, because I think they're going to be scrappy. I think they're going to be physical. I think they're going to be a team that plays with some pace. And I think they're a team that is going to be a hard out, but ultimately miss out on the playoffs. So that's going to do it for this Ottawa Charge preview. Thank you for tuning in. And be sure to check out, of course, the Charge season opening game today, if you're watching this the day that this was released, against the New York Sirens. It would be great to see the Charge go on another run, especially with how, and excuse my language, shitty the arena stuff has been. I get why the Lansdowne 2.0 went ahead, but I think the way that kind of everyone has handled it has gone over poorly, and it's unfortunate the way that things have played out, where a team that wants to play in a certain location, and a women's team specifically, can't in future years because the building is going to be too small. Cool that we're saying that about women's sports, but it's a shame that we have to say it at all, that there's a building that's too small for a team that wants to play there. I think that's where I'm going to leave it on the Lansdowne stuff and kind of everything for the Ottawa Charge here. So again, thank you for tuning into this one. I'll catch you next time. I hope you enjoyed this Ottawa Charge preview, and I hope you enjoy the Ottawa Charge this season. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.